When I was a kid, I had an obsession. Milk. It wasn't just a craving, it was a fixation. Morning, noon, and night, I couldn't get enough of it. A cold glass of milk was my lifeline, my comfort, my one true love. I drank it by the gallon, a white river that seemed endless. My parents didn't mind. They figured it was better than guzzling soda or those neon-colored sugar syrups that masqueraded as juice. Sometimes I'd drink so much, so fast, that my stomach would churn and ache. But even then, I couldn't stop. Nothing could come between me and my milk. Or so I thought. Our kitchen wasn't big enough for the monstrous fridge and freezer my parents owned. So they kept them in the basement, a dark, damp space that always smelled faintly of mildew. I hated going down there, but I loved my milk more. So when my parents left for a second honeymoon that summer trusting 16-year-old me to manage the house alone, I figured I'd survive. My grandparents were just across the street if I needed anything, and the first couple of weeks passed uneventfully. Friends came over, we gorged on takeout, played video games, and generally ignored the creaks and groans of the old house. But then came the night I heard it. I'd just come up from the basement, a glass of milk in hand, ready to head to bed when I heard a bang. Not the usual creak of old wood or the groan of settling beams. This was different. Louder, more deliberate. I froze in the kitchen, the hairs on my arms standing up. Probably just the steps, I whispered to myself, though my voice wavered. Maybe I'd disturbed something, a loose board or a forgotten box shifting as I moved. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the stairs. This sound had a rhythm, a pulse, like someone or something was knocking from within the walls. The next morning, I mustered the courage to go back down. I searched every corner of the basement, expecting to find a raccoon or maybe a possum that had wriggled in through some hidden gap. But the space was empty. Just cobwebs clinging to forgotten furniture and the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I shook it off as a one-time thing and went back to my routine. But the banging came back. The next night, right as I reached the top of the stairs with my glass of milk, it started again. This time, it was louder, closer. It wasn't just the sound of wood, it was the sound of movement, of presence. I locked the basement door and bolted across the street to my grandparents' house. My grandfather, a hulking figure who didn't scare easily, grabbed his shotgun and went to check it out. He returned half an hour later, his brow furrowed but his voice calm. "Didn't find anything," he said. "Probably just an animal hiding in the crawl spaces." But I knew better. I stayed at my grandparents' house after that, only returning to my own home during the day to handle chores. I refused to go back into the basement. My milk obsession faded. Eating and drinking at my grandparents' table felt safer. Then, about a week before my parents returned, a summer storm rolled in, knocking out the power for 2 days. When I finally went back to open the house up again, a new horror awaited me. The smell hit me first. A putrid, sour stench that clung to the walls and seemed to seep up from the floorboards. It was thick, oppressive, and sickeningly sweet, like something rotting in the damp darkness below. And then I heard it again, the banging. Louder now, frantic and unrelenting. It wasn't coming from the stairs this time. It was coming from the refrigerator. Knowing the power had been out, I assumed the putrid smell filling the house was coming from the fridge and freezer. The food inside must have started to rot, and while the thought of dealing with it made my stomach churn, I didn't want my parents to return to such a mess. Still, I couldn't bring myself to face it that day. My grandparents were out of town visiting my great-uncle, so there was no backup. Alone, I opted for the easiest solution, spraying air freshener over the stench, eating dry cereal, and drinking water to avoid opening the basement door. That summer night was unbearably hot, so I turned on the AC before heading to bed, hoping the cool air would at least make the stench tolerable. It didn't. I woke around 4 a.m. drenched in sweat. The air was thick and muddy, worse than when I'd gone to sleep, and the smell, it was everywhere. It clung to the walls, seeped into my clothes, and coated my tongue with an unbearable sweetness laced with something sour and rotten. The stench had a sinister quality. It was more than just spoiled food. It was layered, sulfuric, like rotting eggs, mixed with the sickeningly sweet stench of decay. It reminded me of a childhood incident when my dad had accidentally unplugged the fridge, leaving the milk to spoil. I still remembered that putrid, chunky sludge and how it had made me gag uncontrollably. But this was worse. I stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before vomiting. My stomach wrenched violently, emptying itself as the smell seemed to invade every pore of my body. Tears streamed down my face. I could taste it, feel it, breathe it. It wasn't just in the house, it felt like it was inside me. As I rinsed my mouth at the sink, I noticed something strange. The air vents weren't pushing out cool air anymore. Instead, they seemed to exhale the foul odor, amplifying it. I knew I hadn't turned off the AC, and the power outage from days before must have fried the system. That's when I realized I couldn't stay in that house. Not with the heat and the stench pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. In nothing but my underwear, I bolted across the street to my grandparents' house. I spent the rest of the night curled on their couch, still shivering despite the warmth, haunted by the stench that lingered in my nostrils. The next morning, when my grandparents returned, I told them about the situation. They weren't thrilled that I'd let it fester, but they agreed to help me deal with the mess. Worse would be an understatement for the odor that greeted us as we opened the front door. My grandmother paled immediately, gagging and retreating to the porch. Even my grandfather, a man of stoic resolve, faltered as he stepped inside. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, covering his nose and mouth. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice muffled but firm. But I couldn't just stand outside while he ventured into that hellish miasma alone. As soon as I heard the basement door creak open, my curiosity, or maybe my dread, got the better of me. I cut through the house, following him to the kitchen. The air grew heavier the closer I got to the basement door. The smell wasn't just unbearable, now it was alive, pulsing, almost sentient. And as my grandfather descended the stairs, I swore I heard something beneath the rancid stench. A sound. Faint, but deliberate. A wet, slithering drag coming from the shadows below. Walking into the kitchen that day was like standing inches from an open oven door. Only instead of heat, it was the stench that hit me, a thick, suffocating wave that clawed its way into my throat. I could hear my grandfather retching and coughing as he descended the basement stairs. He was a man of iron will, but even he couldn't withstand whatever was down there. I stumbled to the basement door, my own eyes watering, my stomach churning. The air seemed to press against my skin, thick and heavy, as if the house itself was trying to push me away. I had never heard my grandfather curse before, not once in my life, but that day, he unleashed a stream of expletives so raw, it made my blood run cold. I should have stayed back. I should have listened when he told me to go outside with my grandmother. But something curiosity, dread, or sheer stupidity urged me forward. The staircase felt like a descent into something far worse than a mere basement. The smell only grew stronger as I crept closer, a nauseating cocktail of rotting meat, sour milk, and something acrid that burned my nostrils. And then I saw it. The noises I'd dismissed as the house settling, or maybe an animal rummaging in the walls, they hadn't come from either. They had come from a person. The body hung grotesquely in the stifling air, its limbs slack, its skin bloated and discolored from the relentless heat of summer. The smell, God, the smell. It wasn't just in the air. It was in the walls, the floor, in my very pores. Thick, viscous fluid seeped down the basement walls, pooling into dark, rancid puddles that soaked into the floorboards. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The body was suspended in such a way that it almost seemed like it was watching me. Time had not been kind to the corpse. The heat had accelerated its decay, and the sight was something I knew would haunt me forever. My grandfather tried to shield me, stepping between me and the horror, but it was too late. I had seen everything. The police arrived hours later, their faces pale beneath their uniforms as they worked to remove the body. The investigation turned up little. They believed the person had been homeless, sneaking in through a window I might have forgotten to lock. Perhaps they had sought shelter, food, or simply a place to rest. But instead, they'd found death. The worst part? I couldn't shake the guilt. The noises they'd made in the night had driven me away to my grandparents' house. Maybe, just maybe, if I had stayed, I would have heard them call for help. If they had called for it at all, the aftermath was unbearable. Even after the body was removed, the basement fumigated, and every piece of furniture down there thrown out, the smell lingered. It clung to the house like a ghost, creeping into every corner, refusing to let us forget. My parents couldn't stand it. They sold the house and moved just one street over, but the smell never really left. From what I hear, every new family that moves in complains about it. As for me, I couldn't go near the basement door without my stomach twisting. And Milk, my beloved Milk, became an impossible thing. The mere thought of it brought the memory rushing back, the fluids dripping down the walls, the putrid sweetness of decay. Even fresh milk carried the phantom stench of death, trapped in the back of my throat like a cruel joke. Once, I loved milk. Now I hate it.